Hello, everyone, and welcome to this wonderful panel hosted by my alma mater, Georgetown University. It's always wonderful to be back with Georgetown, even if during these strange times it's on Zoom rather than actually on campus in Washington, D.C. My name is Emma Green. I'm a staff writer at The Atlantic magazine, where I cover politics, policy, and religion. And in my reporting, I often get the pleasure of writing about the relationship between the United States and the Vatican, and more broadly, affairs of the Catholic Church. I am so delighted to be joined here today by a stellar lineup of panelists, including people whose work I very much admire. And I am also delighted to be hosting this event in collaboration with the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs on Georgetown's campus. On this panel of Vatican diplomacy, we have Kathleen Kavanagh, who is the Darrell and Juliet Libby Professor at Boston College. She has appointments in theology and law, and her work focuses on the intersection of law, religion, ethics, and morality. She's also on the masthead of the Catholic magazine Commonweal as a columnist. We have the Reverend Drew Christensen, the Distinguished Professor of Ethics and Human Development at the Georgetown School of Foreign Service. He's also a senior fellow at the Berkeley Center. He's a frequent consultant to the Holy See and on the steering committee of the Catholic Peacebuilding Network. He served on the Holy See delegation to negotiate the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. We have Josh McElwee, the award-winning Vatican correspondent and international news editor for the National Catholic Reporter. He is the co-editor of a Pope Francis lexicon and someone who I follow very closely for all of his insider reporting on the latest at the Vatican. Finally, we have Sean Casey, who is the director of the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs. He's also a professor at Georgetown School of Foreign Service. He served as the U.S. Special Representative for Religion and Global Affairs at the U.S. Department of State's Office of Religion and Global Affairs. Before we get started with the substance of our panel, a few housekeeping notes. This webinar will be recorded and will be posted on the event page at the Berkeley Center's website shortly after the completion of the event. If you registered for this event, you will also be receiving an email with a link to the captioned video as soon as it's available. At the end of our discussion, we will have 15 or 20 minutes of Q&A from the audience and welcome anyone to submit questions. If you'd like to submit a question, you can open the Q&A box at the bottom of the Zoom screen and type your question there. And with that, I'd like to turn to our panelists who will each give us a short intro to our conversation on their thoughts about the biggest challenges that have faced U.S. Vatican diplomacy over the past 4 years under the Trump administration, and what they can anticipate for the next 4 years under President Biden. I want to start with Josh, whose reporting has been really critical in this area. Josh, could you sort of set the table for the challenges that we've seen and the challenges that we might anticipate ahead?
Yeah, thank you, Emma. Thank you for that kind introduction. I'm very happy to be with you all today. Thank you to Sean and the Berkeley Center. This is really wonderful. I'm really glad to focus on the interaction between the US and the Vatican in this way. As Emma mentioned, my name is Joshua McElwee. I'm the Vatican correspondent for the National Catholic Reporter, an independent news organization some of you may know. If you don't, small advertisement, our website is ncronline.org. I'm coming to you from Rome, where I've been based since early 2014, covering Pope Francis's papacy up close and reporting on the impact the Pope has had on the Catholic Church really across the world. So as the only Vatican beat reporter on the panel, I kind of thought my job here was to give a bit of the on-the-ground perspective. I've had a pretty good view of US diplomacy towards the Vatican during the last 2 ambassadorships. So for Callista Gingrich, who was the current ambassador under President Trump, and Ken Hackett, who was the last ambassador under President Obama. There's a lot to say in terms of the contrast between the approaches of the 2 administrations, even in the appointments they made for who would be ambassador. Hackett is known and widely known in Catholic circles as the longtime head of Catholic Relief Services. He had decades of experience working with church officials, well known in the Vatican's loggia, and clearly seen by the Secretary of State here as someone they could collaborate with. He was even appointed a papal knight 3 years into his tenure. It shows the kind of esteem he was held in. Gingrich came to the job here with very little formal outside experience, never having served as a diplomat or in any official role in the church like Hackett had. But I think the biggest problem the Trump administration or Gingrich has faced has more to do with just the fact that it's the Trump administration and not anything to do about Gingrich's qualifications. Anyone even tangentially familiar with the positions of President Trump and Pope Francis would see huge areas of contrast between these two figures. A sidebar here is I remember making a very unprofessional gasp on the papal flight back from Mexico in 2016 after we had spoken to Pope Francis about then candidate Trump's border wall proposal and how Francis had questioned Trump's Christianity in terms of a person who decides to build walls and not bridges. So that's just one issue, but there are many at which you would see some kind of difference between the Vatican and the US administration under Trump. But I think what we've seen here, we have to say that Gingrich has to be given some credit for managing that relationship. She has certainly been able to work with the Vatican Secretary of State and has been able to involve Cardinal Parolin, the Vatican's chief diplomat, in dialogues in areas where they could be had. We've seen that most especially on issues of global religious freedom and on the rise of anti-Semitism in Europe. Of course, you might say those were kind of tangential issues. They didn't get at the core of Pope Francis's ministry in the church or of Trump's America First foreign policy, but kind of sidestepped those to work on issues that they could kind of in areas where they could. I think going forward, this might be where we start to see a big difference between the Trump and Biden's engagement with the Vatican, where Gingrich could navigate a bit on those tangential issues. I think Biden's ambassador may be able to speak more to the Pope's core diplomatic concerns. Things like climate change, strengthening international institutions like the UN or the EU, the continuing migration crisis, arms control, and those kinds of issues could go on and on. I think for Catholics, the wild card might be the US Bishops' Conference. There is a small minority of US bishops who have been increasingly open about being critical about Pope Francis, and they may protest if the Vatican is working too closely with the Biden administration or isn't critiquing Biden on his stance on legalized abortion. But the nuance I would put into the conversation here is from my conversations with Vatican diplomats, I think it's pretty clear that the Vatican does not see itself as only having to represent the bishops of the country. They will certainly listen to those concerns and raise them with church officials or with administration officials, but then will go on to make their own determinations. A good example of that in recent years is the deal the Vatican has made with Beijing over appointing bishops in mainland China. They have gone forward with that deal despite vocal protests from some fairly prominent bishops, including a very vocal cardinal, Joseph Zen. And there's lots of news reporting on that if you want to look into it. So my kind of cutesy language here is I think in some sense we might see the Vatican and US diplomacy in the 2020s borrowing a bit from Bill Clinton's congressional policy in the 1990s, with the Vatican triangulating between the Biden administration and the US Bishops' Conference and making its own determinations about how it wants to represent itself to the Biden administration. I guess I'll leave it there for now. I'm very grateful to be here and I look forward to hearing from everyone else. Thank you.
Josh, thank you so much for those comments. I'll turn now to Kathy Cavaney, who can offer some insights into the relationship that the Holy See has traditionally had with the United States and how that might intersect with some of the bigger issues that she follows: law, ethics, morality, theology.
Great. Well, thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this panel. It's always lovely to be at Georgetown, whether in person or virtually as today. And so I'm very grateful. And thank you, Emma, for your very kind introduction. Now, I should start with a caveat. I am not an expert in global relations or even the intersection of Christian ethics and international relations like my distinguished academic colleagues on the panel. And I certainly don't have my pulse on Vatican relations in the US and the world like Josh does. I am more of an Americanist, an American lawyer, and a Catholic ethicist. So I view my job on this panel really as clearing the way for the far more interesting comments that preceded mine and will follow mine by clearing up a few potential misunderstandings. It's tempting for many Americans and American Catholics to think of the Vatican, the Pope, almost exclusively as a source of religiously based doctrinal and moral teaching, sort of the home office of the Catechism of the Catholic Church, so to speak. That is true, but it is not all that is true. The Vatican is the current temporal location of the Holy See, which has in practice and in the writing of modern legal scholars been seen as a subject of public international law with rights and duties analogous to those of other nation states. The Holy See is a sovereign entity, and as a sovereign entity, this is point 3 of 5 points, the Holy See maintains bilateral diplomatic relationships with over 183 sovereign states. It signs concordats and treatises. It performs multilateral diplomacy with many international and intergovernmental organizations, including the United Nations. It has its own diplomatic school, the Pontifical Ecclesiastical Academy. And in addition to canon law and theology, the school offers practical training in diplomatic history, languages, and diplomatic practice. You need to have a working knowledge of at least 2 languages in addition to your mother tongue to graduate from this school. So it's practical. Now, the normative vision animating the diplomacy of the Holy See is, of course, a Catholic vision. And in February of this year, for example, Pope Francis announced that all students must spend a year of missionary service in order to graduate from the diplomatic school. But the normative vision is, I think, the long tradition of casuistry, gradualism, and patience. It's an old tradition that it comes from the fact that the Holy See and the Roman Empire were intertwined for centuries. It's not the tradition of culture wars, and it isn't in particular the tradition of the brand of culture wars that animates certain segments of American Catholicism on both the liberal and conservative sides. So I think, and I will leave it here, in thinking about diplomatic relationships between the US and the Holy See, I think it will be important for the president, for President Biden, to think beyond American politics and the role that Catholics play in American politics. Our ambassadorships to the Holy See should not be viewed merely as political rewards for red Catholics or blue Catholics in turn, depending upon who is the president at the time. I think at this moment in American relationships with the Holy See, we need to take seriously the prudence and expertise of the Holy See's network of diplomatic relations and the role that we can play in partnership with the Holy See in creating a just and more stable world. So bottom line, the relationship between the United States and the Holy See isn't simply a matter of American Catholic controversies and fights. We've got a world of opportunity, and I trust the next 2 panelists to expand on what those might be. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Kathy, for those helpful framing comments. Sean, you've had a front row seat to diplomatic challenges around the world, including the way that the United States works with the Vatican. I wonder if you could share your observations about that relationship over the last 4 years and what you see as potential opportunities in the years ahead.
Thank you, Emma, and thank you both Kathy and Josh, you've set up my remarks perfectly. And I think your observation about triangulation, Josh, is very, very wise. And Kathy, the invocation of patience and taking the long view is what I think is so often overlooked and misunderstood by Americans as they look at this diplomatic relationship between the Holy See and the United States. I think that the past 4 years of this relationship have been really quite hard for the Vatican, particularly after getting as close to a career diplomat in Ken Hackett as one could find in a political appointee for the reasons that Josh laid out. I think that the most concrete thing they're looking for, and every year, or I mean, every term, it seems the Vatican quietly sends signals to the United States that they would like a career diplomat rather than a political diplomat for some of the very reasons that both Kathy and Josh outlined. On the one hand, there's no learning curve for a career diplomat. They understand the American diplomatic apparatus in a way that a political ambassador is never going to know. So that political ambassador has to learn the inside of the Vatican, so while simultaneously from Rome, trying to learn the insides of the American diplomatic apparatus. And the learning curves are very steep on both sides. You can get you can get a career ambassador approved almost instantly, whereas it will take 9 to 12 months to get a political appointee vetted and approved by the Senate because of the security and financial background checks that have to go on. So you can get a very quick start to a diplomatic relationship if you appoint a career diplomat. I think we have a pope in a hurry. I think we have a president in a hurry. And so it makes perfect sense to take this opportunity now for President Biden to actually choose a career diplomat. In the Vatican, as I understand it, would even accept a non-Catholic. They want somebody who can do the diplomacy, and they're not so concerned about the theological status of the actual incumbent in the position. There's also a symbolism attached to that if we appoint a career diplomat, it's a signal to that receiving country that you're at the big country table in that sense, that you are seen as valuable enough that we will not saddle you with perhaps a less than perfect political appointee. And finally, I think it will insulate them from the culture wars in the American Catholic Church if you put a career diplomat in place, because inevitably a political pick will be assessed in the United States as either rewarding this particular group or that particular group of the American Catholic Church. And as Kathy, you pointed out, the Vatican doesn't care about that, whereas a career person would do it. Now, everybody I talk to, I preach this sermon to these days, and a very good friend of mine, a very astute interpreter of the American Catholic Church says, you know, the Catholic kid from Scranton is not going to be able to resist the chance opportunity to appoint a political person to this position. And that may well in the end be true. The second thing in terms of the vexed relationship is if you think back to President Trump's very first international trip, he went to Riyadh first, and he sold hundreds of millions of dollars of US weapons to the Saudis. And in his final speech said, oh, by the way, we are not going to tell you how to run your country. And he completely undercut almost all of his administration's work on international religious freedom. He similarly did that when he sat across the table from President Xi of China and said, go ahead and build your camps for the Uyghurs. It's the right thing to do. Both of these really astonishingly bad diplomatic faux pas undercut all of his other efforts on international religious freedom. The second stop on that trip was in Jerusalem, where his pro-Israel, anti-Palestinian policy was unveiled. And of course, this did not comport with the Vatican's historical interest in a two-state solution in the Holy Land. The third stop on that trip was actually in Rome. So I understand they have Google in the Vatican. They actually watch news and read news in the Vatican. And so they read the press readouts of both the astonishing trip to Riyadh and to Jerusalem, and then they came to the Vatican. Now, I do know the Vatican was really quite pleased and felt honored that he stopped. And it was actually a diplomatic, a really fine move on the president's part to show up. But he came with the press records of what he did at the first two stops, which I think spent a lot of that capital very, very quickly. Now, in terms of the Biden administration, I really have 2 points here. First of all, there's reason for great hope and great progress here, despite the fact he is in fact a pro-life Catholic, which that will never be transcended in the relationship. It's just a fact, and there's going to be noise, and there'll be implications of that the entire length of Biden's term. However, when you look at the foreign policy priorities of the impending American administration and that of the papacy of Francis, as already has been noted, there's just tremendous overlap between the priorities. Climate change, rebuilding the global refugee resettlement network, seeking Middle East peace, combating anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, confronting global populist movements all around the planet, and as I think Drew is going to say more, about reducing nuclear arms. So the potential is there, not unlike the potential that John Kerry had when he was named Secretary of State 4 years ago, or 8 years ago, actually. There's great opportunity for overlap there, and I really do think the Vatican wants to get down to business, and I'm confident that our new president to be the Roman Catholic Joe Biden is eager to find ways to collaborate together. Now, let me say finally, and this often gets overlooked, and I think was missed by the Trump administration, the Vatican actually can help the United States in some incredibly difficult diplomatic scenarios right now. The irony is the Secretary Pompeo took to print and took to public speech to harangue the Vatican over their diplomatic relations with China over a deal that to this day remains secret. Nobody has read that deal. We only have the sketchiest of outlines. And yet the Secretary of State for the United States actually condemned them and challenged them over that relationship. I actually view it the other way. Whatever that agreement contains or doesn't contain, the Vatican diplomatic corps are really one of the few among the 200 or so sovereign states in the country that can say they've been in at least modestly successful long-term negotiations with the Chinese. If I were Secretary of State, I would have said, I know you can't tell us the details, we don't want to know the details, but can you give us any clues, any hints, any insights in how to engage China on a diplomatic basis? The Trump administration's diplomacy with China is a mess. We have receded in the last 4 years, and they seem to be clueless. And here you have a sovereign state, tiny though it may be, that actually has some defensible success in engaging them. They've done what nobody else seems to be able to do. Secondly, we've regressed on our relationships with Cuba. The Vatican played a huge role in America's reestablishment of diplomatic relations in the Obama administration. If Biden wants to restore those relations and deepen them and expand them, again, the Vatican can be a helpful conversation partner in helping us repair that relationship. The last country, which no one seems to be talking about, is Ethiopia. We may be watching a genocide unfold before our eyes. The Vatican actually has some very interesting connectivity and resources with respect to the Ethiopian government. Catholics make up about 2% of the population there, but they have a remarkable cardinal there who I met when he was an archbishop. And even though 2% of Ethiopians are Catholics, their education system trained most of the political elite in the country. The Prime Minister of Ethiopia, Abiy Ahmed, has actually appointed Cardinal Serafiel as the head of an Ethiopian Reconciliation Commission. So he seems to be the one religious leader in the country who has the ear of the Prime Minister and has actually served in a semi-official diplomatic capacity there internally in Ethiopia. If I were in the Secretary of State's office now or in the White House trying to mitigate the possible genocide, I would be trying to learn everything I could from the brain of the cardinal there, to say nothing of a highly professional nuncio who was just installed there about a year ago. It doesn't seem like this administration cares other than to issue a press release, oh my goodness, stop the fighting, please, which seldom actually prevents the kind of atrocities that may be unfolding before our eyes right now. Let me just say, in my many trips to Rome as a diplomat, you can learn a lot in Rome. And just simply going door to door in the dicasteries, meeting with other ambassadors to the Holy See, if you ask the right questions and you listen well, Rome is an amazing center of international travel and diplomacy. And there are so many resources to be tapped there that pay off manifold diplomatic benefits. So I really do think the Biden administration is going to take advantage of that location.
Thanks so much, Sean. Those were really helpful insights from your unique experience in the roles that you've had. Drew, you've also had quite a distinctive career and really have seen from the inside how the Holy See thinks about this relationship. I'd love for you to share some of your insights and observations about what we've been living through and what we can look forward to under the Biden administration.
Thank you, Emma. Thank you, Sean, and all my colleagues on the panel today. I think that the world is ready for the U.S. to come back into oh.
There you are.
Can we start again? I beg your indulgence. Just since last night, I've begun to develop problems with stability in my system. So I may go on and off. Just wait a second and we'll be able to get it back on, I think. But I apologize for any interruptions. But I was about to say that I think much of the world is looking forward to the US return to international affairs and international collaboration. And I use that word advisedly. The world that we return to is not the world we left. Other processes have taken place, like China's Belt and Road policy and internal developments within the European Union that mean that the world that we had is not what President Biden is going to be entering into. And I think there needs to be a certain amount of caution in thinking we can go back into that world with the kind of weight that we had beforehand. I think people will welcome us, but we need to go as collaborators and participants, sometimes having a leading role and other times not necessarily doing that. And I get some hints sometimes, despite Tony Blinken's really quite modest demeanor, that U.S. is, many in the U.S. are just ready to take hold of the reins again. I think that would be a mistake. I think the world really wants the U.S. engaged. The best way we can do that is by our own example, for instance, with climate change or reforms on refugee and migrant admission on the borders, doing internal change that moves in the right direction will do more than trying to assert our power. I think also there are two developments, psychological developments we need to take into account as a result of the Trump years. One is that there's great suspicion. There's great suspicion of the U.S. Falling back into a populist kind of mode, and therefore sense that there will not be an ongoing kind of relationship. And so there's hesitation to make strong commitments to us. And I think on the other hand, there's the experience of taking charge or trying to take charge of their own agenda, particularly in the European Union and in NATO. And I think we need to be able to participate that as a senior member, but not necessarily as the hegemon, as we may have been for some period after the end of the Cold War. I think that's very important. And I think it's there that the Vatican can have the greatest role to play. It can lead us, it seems to me, in being able, or not to lead us, but help us in being able to collaborate with others. Multilateralism is a very strong conviction in Vatican diplomacy, both because it believes in the global order, but also because it believes that multilateralism is a hedge against hegemonic and unilateralism in the world, particularly military unilateralism. But furthermore, the Holy See does a lot of its work in multilateral forums, in the United Nations proper, both in New York and in Geneva, in the Organization of American States and other international bodies where it's a member, where it has representation. It's very close to many other countries because of that. And it was a part of the coalition that put together the treaty to prohibit nuclear weapons. Now, I think it's going to be very difficult for the US to back off its position against that treaty. But I think the Holy See could provide a channel for communication between the proponents of the treaty to prohibit nuclear weapons and those who want to go with the traditional arms control approach. The treaty to prohibit nuclear weapons is imperfect, as I've written. It doesn't have very clear disarmament arrangements. It doesn't have safeguards built in. It could use the input of diplomats who've had long experience in arms control. But those same diplomats think, wrongly, I believe, that the treaty undermines the global order of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. As a matter of fact, the treaty itself is built on the Non-Proliferation Treaty and its desire for general and complete disarmament, including nuclear disarmament. And the U.S., the Holy See rather, could serve as an intermediary between those who really support the agreement and those who are its critics, and help to forge some positive kinds of understandings between them as to how they can contribute to one another. The nuclear agenda is very dangerous. I think people don't realize how dangerous it is. We no longer live in a bipolar world. We live in a multipolar world where there are 9 nuclear powers. You can't hold stability up with deterrence in that kind of environment, especially when multiple powers say we're not just going to use our weapons for deterrence. We're going to use them to go against radiological weapons, against biological weapons, to defend against a major face-losing loss in a confrontation. We need to get away from that. We need to get back to where nuclear weapons are only used for deterrence, and then move away from deterrence towards global zero and disarmament. And the Vatican, I think, understands that and understands that you need to do that stepwise, but you still need to move in that direction. And I think it can be a great channel of communication between the contending parties in the arms control arena. And with that, I'll stop.
Thank you, Drew, for those comments. I'd love to pick up on one of the threads that you laid down in your comments, talking about multilateral relationships and the way that the Vatican can really be useful to the United States in those. In my view, the biggest relationship question for the Biden administration in its foreign policy is China. Whether it will continue the type of aggressive relationship that the Trump administration has laid out, and whether it will seek to lay further channels of communication in its relationship with China. I think this has been particularly complicated by economic issues and COVID and the kind of communication or lack of communication between the two countries. I wonder if, Sean, you could start by giving us some brief thoughts about the potential for the Vatican's role in working as an intermediary or an advisor in that relationship with China. And then perhaps others of the panelists could chime in about the way that this relationship between the US and China, the Vatican and China, may develop over the next few years.
That's a great question, and all I have are hypotheses at this point. I think the Biden administration is going to engage the full range of issues. Biden has made some, and Tony Blinken also, he made some very strong statements about human rights violations and the situation of the Uyghurs in China. And China is going to be the center of our foreign policy for a long time to come. And I know at the end of the Obama administration, when we had seen the relationship really sour, there were sort of 2 issues left that the Obama administration could engage China with some depth and interest. One was climate change, and the Chinese actually have been very clear. The dilemma they face in terms of their development curve, but also the amount of carbon they're releasing into the atmosphere per capita is a disaster, and they're very clear-eyed about that. So, remember, we cut a bilateral agreement with China before the Paris Accord that was internationally hailed. So, interestingly enough, while China grew increasingly bellicose and difficult to engage on human rights, one of the issues they kept engaging with us on was climate change. And the other, interestingly enough, which gets very little press, was about the administration and running of cities. The urban population of China is exploding. The political, logistical management issues about transitioning from a rural country towards a majority urban country are exceedingly complex, and there were very fruitful exchanges. So I think the Biden administration is going to try to engage at every level. They're going to push every button that can be pushed. And it's going to be clunky, it's going to be messy, because the Chinese are not going to do a 180-degree turn on human rights just because our new Secretary of State says, shame on you yet again. So I think there's going to be a really deep, robust menu of ways we engage with them. And the Chinese do seem to have at least a modicum of sophistication on one or two big issues. I think it's still plausible that we can walk through those doors and start talking. Those might be the first doors we approach to build some kind of confidence going forward that we can build on, perhaps to expand to a more robust engagement on human rights and the economy. So I think it's going to be a full court press. I think the Biden administration is going to look for every opportunity to engage the Chinese in hopes that over time, taking this more Vatican long-term view rather than a culture wars, what have you done for me lately kind of approach. So that's my best hope, is that we'll take, and I think Obama tried the long-term approach, and 8 years is not a long term of time diplomatically.
Thanks, that was really helpful. I wonder if any of the other panelists have short thoughts to add there. Perhaps Josh, the reporting that you've done on the ground in Rome could be an additive here. Anybody else want to chime in?
Yeah, I would actually like to chime in just on the ethics issue. I mean, it's true. In a way, maybe I'm taking back a little bit what I said in my first comments, which was, the Holy See is not just Catechism Central. On the other hand, the Vatican does have a rich ethical tradition and a rich moral tradition. We sometimes call it natural law, but we believe there's a possibility of conversation among people of very, very different, belief systems. That's in a way what the idea of natural law was trying to get at, although sometimes it's articulated in a very unsophisticated way. China is going to be with us and with the United States and with the West as an adversary, as a trading partner, as a global force, for the foreseeable future. So one possibility would be to maybe, use the sources of the Vatican to try to create maybe a conversation about comparative ethics. Looking, for example, I've heard, Confucian ethics is something that China is thinking of bringing in as a way of kind of providing a framework. One of the objections to international law and to the language of human rights is that it's exclusively Western oriented. One thing that we could do, as American Christian ethicists, but also in partnership with the Vatican, is really to work on, looking at the overlap of Confucian ethics and some of the, the natural law tradition that in one form or other has animated the common morality of the West.
May I add something here?
Please.
Well,
I had a role for a while in nurturing the relationships, and used to say I felt like a mouse between two elephants in doing that. But one, I learned that personal relationships mean a lot, and I think that keeping alive contacts with among the Chinese leadership, among the intellectual class, among the literate class, are very important in being able to establish relations over the long haul. I remember after assisting one member of the leadership that, I said, well, you're a member of the family, you can do no wrong now. Well, that's real important that those kind of relations that's still very important in a Confucian culture. They're much more important than they are in a Western culture. And so those personal contacts and personal ties are very important. The second is that China regards itself not as just a nation state, but as a civilizational state, meaning that they have a 5,000-year-old history that that distinguishes them and gives them a particular outlook and standing in the world. And one of the things that I think, and I've written this, and the Chinese have published it in their own publications, that one of the things that makes them open to Pope Francis is that the Catholic Church understands that they are a distinctive culture and has honored that. And they go back to the Jesuits in the 17th century. But Pope Francis himself, with his emphasis on receiving the gospel within the context of an individual culture, is open to that kind of thing. And I think greater respect for the culture is a way to build up the relationships. I mean, a couple of the things that the Vatican did in promoting this relationship was to invite China to come to conferences on environment in Rome, and also this exchange exhibits in Matteo Ricci for his anniversary. Matteo Ricci being the great Chinese Jesuit missionary in China in the 16th and early 17th century. I think that those kinds of cultural events that tap into the respect for China as a civilizational power can also kind of work in the background. Things are very different from when I was working on these relationships 10 years ago. There was a collective leadership. Now there really is a single leader in President Xi, but behind him there are all these other people who I think can influence policy over time, and we need to do things that will keep those ties and relationships alive.
Great, thank you so much.
Add,
oh yeah, please, Josh.
I mean, just one note, I mean, based on the example of the Vatican's deal with China over the appointment of bishops, I mean, the Pope has something that Biden doesn't have, which is a lifelong appointment. And the Vatican has been able to engage with China for a long period, kind of with a progression of policy. I mean, the deal came about 2 years ago. That's 5 years into Pope Francis's papacy. And it only came out because the two popes before Francis, especially in the early 2000s, had started to change and started to engage China. So, I mean, it's been a 20-year process, and I don't know kind of what Biden can affect in that kind of short-term range.
MMA, I just had a quick footnote here. We've just published a white paper on religion. We have running a series by Peter Mandeville on religion and soft power. And he just issued a white paper with two scholars looking at the Chinese use of religion and soft power. And they now have a Buddhism promotion campaign, basically. And so I take, Kathy, your point. We tried to run a religious scholar convocation with a group of Chinese government humanities professors, actually religion scholars. The government has a whole cadre of very sophisticated religion scholars. We just ran out of time. You can't spin up a bilateral conference with the Chinese government on a dime. But there is an opening here, I think, for American and other Western intellectuals to show that actually Buddhism has an openness to other religious systems and ethical systems, and there is a way where you might actually be able to have some incredibly sophisticated conversations about the ethics from diverse philosophical and religious backgrounds if you can find the right interlocutors in the government. And so this is a space where if Biden ends up having 8 years, they could actually do something or ask some other academic institution to do that. But
Thanks so much.
That paper's on our website. You should be able to find it.
Terrific. So that's so helpful. And I want to also remind everyone who is watching at home that we are collecting Q&A questions for the last 10 minutes of the conversation. You can open the box at the bottom of your Zoom screen and offer a question there. I am collecting those. Before we turn to audience Q&A, though, I do want to touch on a big question in my mind that also touches on some big news that we've had recently about the relationship between the U.S. Bishops' Conference and the Vatican. We recently saw a large report about the way that the U.S. Bishops' Conference passed on or didn't pass on information about then Cardinal McCarrick, or then Archbishop McCarrick, who, as we now know, has been widely accused, credibly accused of sexually harassing seminarians, among others, young boys. And I bring this up because it is by far the largest piece of news in US Catholic life in the last 6 months, but also because I think it speaks to the trust problem that the hierarchy in the United States may have in terms of its credibility with US government officials, its ability to credibly speak about an open and transparent relationship with the Vatican, and moreover, a sort of credibility problem with the American public, seeing the Conference of Catholic Bishops as a sort of channel for US diplomacy or an enabler of US diplomacy with the Vatican. So I'd love to start with Josh, turning back to you to talk about that relationship. How powerful and credible is the US Catholic Bishops Conference, and what are some challenges that might be there for the US hierarchy?
Well, I think it's an important question, but I think we also have to draw some distinctions. So this report about Cardinal Theodore McCarrick, who had been the Archbishop of Washington from, I think, 2001 to 2005, was issued by the Vatican. But I think a lot of the material isn't so much about the US Bishops Conference as it is about the Vatican. And so at that time of McCarrick's rise, especially when he is appointed to Washington in 2000, 2001 from the Archdiocese of Newark in New Jersey, the real question is, what did Pope John Paul II at the time and what did the Vatican officials at the time know about allegations that had been coming forward about McCarrick's behavior? Now, some of these allegations weren't specific, but the big thing that the report, which the Vatican released a couple weeks ago, that we were able to discern for the first time was that the Cardinal in New York, John O'Connor, had basically warned John Paul II about the appointment. That doesn't really involve the US Bishops Conference because John O'Connor wasn't acting on behalf of the Bishops Conference, but was writing as the cardinal to Pope John Paul II. Basically, a cardinal is one of the Pope's key advisors. And so giving the Pope advice about basically saying he had heard things that concerned him about then Archbishop McCarrick and saying that he didn't think McCarrick should have another appointment. And what the McCarrick report from the Vatican revealed to us was that John Paul II went ahead with the appointment anyways. Of course, he took it on McCarrick's word that he hadn't done what he had been accused of and decided to do that. I think on the separate issue of how the US Bishops Conference might be involved in the Vatican's efforts towards diplomacy with the Biden administration, I think obviously we're going to see statements from the Bishops Conference on various issues. That's what they do. The Bishops Conference is organized in Washington with different committees and councils, and they issue statements and they have working groups. They've announced a couple of weeks ago at their annual meeting that they will have some sort of group to discuss how the bishop should be engaging with Biden as a Catholic, basically despite the fact that he's a pro-choice Catholic. But again, I think the Vatican will make some of its own determinations in terms of what best reflects the Pope's ministry, the Pope's interests in terms of international dialogue. The Pope, of course, is very clear in the fact that he does not believe abortion is right. He's been very clear about that. No one can really say that the Pope hasn't made clear his point of view on that. But the Pope is also clear in terms of he wants what he calls a culture of encounter, a culture of dialogue. And if there's going to be areas where he can work with the Biden administration on migration or on international institutions or on the nuclear treaty, as Father Christiansen points out, I think they're going to do that.
Does anyone else want to chime in from the panel on potential challenges with this diplomatic relationship between the US government and the Vatican, given the sort of swirl of questions around transparency and the trustworthiness in the public eye of how the Vatican or the US hierarchy is communicated on some of these big controversies?
I guess the only thing I would like to add is that, in a way, you could view the McCarrick report not simply as, kind of a dramatic failure of pastoral care and leadership, on the pastoral side of the relationship between American Catholics and the U.S. Bishops and then the Vatican. But I think it's a really interesting case study in what Nate, Silver once called the signal and the noise, right? Because part of what was at stake in all of this is everybody knew about McCarrick, but nobody knew enough, it seemed, to break through the kind of miasma of rumors and actually get the information in a pointed enough form that the Pope would say, all right, this is a hard stop. I need to actually investigate here. I can't take one person's word or the other person's word. And so the interesting thing for me, from the perspective of the more general topic of this, is how does anybody in authority actually discern the signal, what you have to pay attention to, from the background of the noise, which can be weighed and maybe set aside as gossip, as rumors, or as that. So, it's actually a question of human relations and human judgments. And it's the sort of thing that diplomats have to do all the time. So maybe we do need more connection between the diplomatic corps on the one hand and the pastoral side on the other. And maybe the pastoral side needs to learn something from the diplomatic corps to know about what you need to take up the chain and really make your boss pay attention to and not ignore.
I think that's a really helpful framing, Kathy. Thank you for offering that. And I want to also move to audience Q&A, which I do think connects to some of these themes that we've been discussing. One questioner is wondering whether there are risks for Biden domestically in cozying up too much with the Vatican, seeking too close of a relationship diplomatically because of what you might call the JFK problem. When JFK was running for president, there was widespread concern that his loyalties would be to the Roman Catholic Church rather than to the American public. And I wonder, perhaps, Drew, if you might offer some thoughts about things that have changed and not changed since that time in terms of that perception of the relationship between the American president and the Catholic Church.
Sure. And I think one of the fundamental things that's changed is that anti-Catholicism, although it remains something of a force, it's still the only legitimate prejudice among intellectuals, I think. But I think the anti-Catholic feeling on the part of Protestants is greatly diminished. I think the ecumenical movement has reduced that. And then relations between Catholics and evangelicals are both better and worse, in the sense that the culture wars divide both communities. And so the differences between Catholics and between evangelicals in their own communities are often greater than those between those sharing those similar views. And so that's a very different situation out of which criticism will come. I don't think Biden will suffer so much there. I think there may be more pressure from the culture warriors within the Catholic Church on what they regard as the preeminent issue of abortion than he's going to receive from outside the Catholic community. So, but I think on the whole, there are a lot of positive things, as we've indicated, where the Vatican, Pope Francis, and President Biden can work together. And I think it's not just the people at the top; it's the people in between too who make a great difference. I used to say that votes make a difference because the appointees make a difference. And I think that one of the major differences between the times when I was a primary interlocutor with the Vatican for the American Church and now is that it's the cardinals of the world who have influence. American cardinals, I think, have diminished influence in Rome as American cardinals. They really try to exercise it frequently and sometimes skewed the Vatican vision of things, although I'd have to attribute, say, to President Clinton and Vice President Gore, they really worked deliberately to get through those difficulties in the past, even though the static was being thrown up by the American cardinals. But I think right now, the Council of Cardinals really kind of helps filters all those kinds of influences that are coming in and gives it a much more global perspective, and that will make the communication easier.
Thanks, Drew. That's really helpful. Sean, there's a question for you from the audience. As we know, the State Department under President Trump suffered from lack of refilling of appointments, vacancies, and a large-scale dismantling in some of the sort of soft power diplomatic apparatuses that had been established under the Obama administration. And obviously, this was very close to the work that you did in the State Department. The audience member wants to know whether you believe that some of those efforts will be revived under the Biden administration, and if so, what they might look like.
Well, I think the short answer is yes. I do believe a lot of that capacity will be restored. I think particularly if Tony Blinken is confirmed as the Secretary of State, he certainly was a great help to our office, the Office of Religion and Global Affairs, and keenly understands the role of soft power and how diminished it is today. I'll just simply add, if I can, to follow up on what Drew was saying. Everywhere I traveled, if I had an extra hour, I would go see the cardinal in a nation, or I would go see the nuncio. And as a low church Protestant, I grew up with a lot of stereotypes about how vertically integrated the Catholic Church was, and that everybody from the Pope down to the local parish had the same talking points every day. And any notion that I had that was true was quickly disabused as a diplomat. But as a diplomat, you talk to everybody, and nobody looked at Cardinal McCarrick as like the sole authority who spoke for the Vatican on international issues. He was simply one. Now, he was a free agent. He was all over the world. It wasn't quite clear who he reported to, but nobody came back from meeting with him saying, well, we don't need to investigate what the Vatican feels on this issue anymore because we heard it from his mouth. I tried to engage. We encouraged embassies to engage the local Catholic Church because you get different perspectives from the nuncio in Africa than you maybe get in the Vatican itself in terms of what it thinks about Africa. It's such a complex entity and such a long and deep history. The more inputs you have as a diplomat, the better picture you're probably going to have of where the Vatican is heading on an issue. And we tried to model that. So yeah, I think this kind of activity will be restored. And because I think both President-elect Biden and Secretary of State designate Tony Blinken, and remember, Secretary Kerry is going to have a position working on climate change. So I think you're going to see a really sophisticated, broad-based re-engagement on American soft power, including reaching out to religious entities.
Thanks so much, Sean. For the final question that we'll take from the audience, I want to do a lightning round with our panelists. So these are quick answers from each of you. You could give up to 3, but they have to take the form of a short bullet point. So the question is, what are the top issues that are of a high concern to the U.S. government, the Vatican, and the U.S. Bishops' Conference? So these areas of potential overlap for all 3 of those entities that we could see the most progress on. Let's start from the top, just as we did at the beginning. Josh, what are your very quick lightning round answer?
I think for the U.S. bishops, it would probably be life issues like abortion and execution. For the Vatican, probably climate change, international institutions, the refugee crisis. For the Biden administration, I would also think climate change.
Great. Kathy. Kathy, would you chime in? Oh.
Climate change, I will say, is an overlapping issue.
Great. Terrific. Sean, what's your answer?
I try not to repeat others. I think the global economic inequality is going to be an issue that has not been named. And I also think combating global populism and the promotion of democracy.
Great. And Drew, finally, what are your thoughts?
Well, I think the Non-Proliferation Treaty review and what follows on from that will be very important for both sides. I think migration and refugee policy, not just the US, but also the Mexican bishops, I think have a role to play there. And climate is an overriding issue for everybody.
Great. I think that list gives us a terrific broad view of the way that this relationship might evolve in the coming years. These are really big, urgent topics. And I know that from my perspective as a reporter, this just means that there will be a lot to cover in that relationship between the US government and the Vatican, and the role that the Bishops' Conference also plays as a supporting character in the United States. So we have a lot to look forward to in the coming years, a lot of interesting meat to dig into. I'm so glad that I was able to join you all today, and I'm so grateful to the Berkeley Center for hosting this important conversation. Thank you to everyone who tuned into the live stream and offered questions in the Q&A. I apologize that I couldn't get to everyone's terrific questions. And I'll look forward to future conversations as we know more about how this relationship between the US and the Vatican is going to evolve under President Biden. Thanks so much, everyone, for joining.